Let me ask you this. How would you feel if somebody opened up a great white shark ecotourism expedition company in your backyard on your ocean? We're going to talk about what some people are worried about in Nova Scotia, Canada, about a new company that's doing the exact same thing. We're going to talk about in this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, what you can do to speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about shark expeditions, great white shark expeditions in Nova Scotia, Canada. Now, this is always an interesting topic to discuss because great white sharks are an iconic species. People love them. People fear them. We've all seen the movie Jaws, or if you haven't yet, you're probably too afraid to watch it. On one hand, people fear sharks because of the movie, and on the other hand, it actually sparked a number of studies back in the 70s to really get to know what great white sharks do, where they go, how they grow up, what they like to eat. All this different type of stuff that's really allowed us to understand great whites as well as other sharks to this day, like up to this now. And we're continuing to study great white sharks as well as other species. So it's always an interesting topic when great white sharks come up. But in this case, we're talking about a great white shark expedition company that will attract great white sharks so that people can view sharks in their own backyard in Nova Scotia, Canada. So Dr. Neil Hammerslag, who's been on this podcast before, actually he was one of the first people on this podcast when I did a Shark Week show, my own Shark Week show during Discovery Shark Week here on this podcast. If you look back to one of the first episodes, you'll be able to find it. Neil is a great scientist. He's actually Canadian. He worked at the University of Miami as a shark scientist for a long time, headed and created and launched and headed the shark tagging lab. Did a lot of great work on hammerhead sharks, got protections for hammerhead sharks in Florida waters, spearheaded the careers of people like Dr. Austin Gallagher, Dr. David Schiffman, who are also shark biologists. Austin is the founder as well as CEO of Beneath the Waves. You probably know Dr. David Schiffman. They both have been on this podcast a number of times and doing things in their own way and great things in their own way. And they're great to have on the podcast as well, talking about sharks in their own sort of specialties. And Neil has just done that. His lab was really great in University of Miami. He recently left University of Miami to start this business. But during that time, he really got into science communication. He really helped a lot of people who were going through a science or sort of, a digital marketing and communications program at the University of Miami, brought them on as interns and paid them to take shots as they were tagging and really spearheaded that type of communication. If you go to sharktagging.com, I believe the website is still up there. I'll link to it in the show notes or in the YouTube description if you're watching this on YouTube. But it's just having Neil sort of spearhead this company made me really excited when I first heard about this and saying, wow, this is going to be really interesting because you're having a scientist start a company to bring more awareness of great white sharks within Nova Scotia, educate people, get people to see these beautiful sharks in their own waters, and hopefully do some scientific studies around that. And that's what his hope is. That's what he plans on doing. And it's opening up this year from, he's got permits for this year, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it'll be 5 kilometers off the Atlantic coast near Liverpool, Nova Scotia. And he's done everything that he needs to do from a scientific and conservation perspective. He was issued an endangered species permit from May 1st to November 30th in the years 2023 as well as 2024. So he's gone through that process to get permitting to be able to view great white sharks, which are listed as vulnerable under the Canadian Species at Risk Act. And of course, Neil's a scientist, so he wants the best for these sharks. He's done a lot of work in ecotourism, studied sharks and ecotourism. And I think, it's really interesting when I always love it when a scientist starts a company to not only do science communication in the form of ecotourism, but also do scientific studies. So it's a way of almost generating revenue to fund a lot of his studies. And so the differences of this outfit compared to other outfits in the past is that he doesn't plan on feeding the sharks to attract the sharks. And he doesn't plan on staying in the same spot. So it's not going to be, hey, I'm going to go out to this location and I'm going to, find sharks. And I'm going to bring the sharks to me. I'm going to chum the water and I'm going to bring the sharks to the boat. And that's how we're going to view these sharks. You can view it on top of the boat, or you can go to a cage and dive. That's not how he plans on doing this operation. He's going to find the sharks. He's going to go to different spots. He's going to, randomize those areas. And I'm going to hopefully get him on the show. He's out on a trip right now. Hopefully get him on the show to talk more about what he plans on doing, because I think it's an interesting aspect when it comes from a scientist who's starting this business. Now, of course, this is a company that has undergone a lot of criticism. It's pretty controversial right now for the articles that have come out, because there are people who are concerned about what's going to happen with the sharks' behavior in the area, what's going to happen to other ocean users, how are the sharks going to change their behavior surrounding boats and food, as well as people. And so that's where a lot of the worry is when we talk about, sharks and great white shark attraction. So for one criticism, Aaron McNeil, who's a professor at Dalhousie University's biology department, said he questions the motivations of Neil Hammerslag. So he says, if this was a scientific enterprise, as Neil Hammerslag is saying, you wouldn't. This is a quote from Aaron McNeil. You wouldn't be charging people money and creating a business around it, right? So the motivation, the primary objective here, seems to be having people come and have an experience with these animals, and that's not what you would do if your primary goal is a scientific study. Now, I kind of disagree with this. In the way that we're looking at science in the future, and we've talked about it on the podcast before, is we are looking at how do you generate revenue as a model, as a business model, to be able to study a specific topic within the ocean. For academics, you go and you try and get grants, and if you're successful in getting those grants, you can use sort of your lab and the graduate students and so forth, and educate graduate students and so forth, and build sort of a lab around that grant, and then go out and study sharks, whether it be sharks in ecotourism, whether it be, blue carbon, whether it be, coral reefs, whatever that might be, right? Seagrass studies. You can take a topic and you can get grants and you can build a lab around that, and that's how you do it in the academic world. There's no revenue generating services, although some scientists, some university professors can be consultants, and they can have some of their time devoted towards being consultants, as long as they kick back some of that money to the universities. With nonprofit organizations, a lot of times they get money from donors. They'll get money from granting agencies and foundations. They'll get money from people, you and I, who donate towards a specific cause because we believe in that cause and we want them to go through what they want to do, whether that be lobbying in the government, whether that be changing policy or informing policy, whether that be protesting. It doesn't matter. All these nonprofit organizations fall within a certain rule within each sort of country in terms of their taxes and how the businesses and nonprofits are run, and we donate to support the mission and the vision of those nonprofit organizations, whichever one you choose or whichever one gets to you first. But that's sort of how it works. Now, those models are all set and good, but there's a lot of competition for granting agencies and foundations, government agencies and so forth. There's not enough money to go around for all the work that needs to be done and for all the people who want to do that work. And there's a lot of stuff that goes in that. We've discussed that before in terms of, doing more collaborations and so forth. But there are a lot of people now, or more and more people now, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are more people now who are trying to look at different models to be able to do their own type of work, as well as funding it themselves. So whether they sell a product, whether they sell a service, to do their studies, that's up to them. And I just mentioned earlier in this episode about Dr. Austin Gallagher and his crew at Beneath the Waves. What started off as a film festival that started off in Beneath the Waves for graduate students or people who were doing scientific work and field work and filming it and communicating that has turned into a scientific machine, really, in still having that scientific communication as its foundation, but also being able to do primary research studies in a lot of different places. Being able to do it in blue carbon, to be able to do it as shark surveys and shark tagging and shark studies and conservation, doing deep sea research. Essentially, they can do whatever they would like to do. They have partners. They have sort of hotels as partners. They have, apparel companies that sponsor them. They have grants and they have their own type of service that they provide in various ways. And that helps fund their people and that helps fund the work that they do. I think it's a great model. Now, they are a nonprofit organization, but there are other people who do it as a for-profit organization. And there are more and more people who are trying to do this model, who are working towards this model because they can control the work that they do. And there's something so satisfying about controlling who you can collaborate with, what type of topics you can cover, because it doesn't really follow a narrative of what granting agencies and foundations want, even though they have their own sort of missions and visions themselves, and you have to kind of fall within that. But if you feel that there's other things that you want to follow, and there are other things that you want to study, but there's not a lot of funding for, then you can create your own products. You can create your own revenue generating service that will allow you to go and do the work that you want to do. And to be honest, it's not an easy work to do. However, you can do it and you can do great work. The Marine Megafauna Foundation out in Africa and worldwide now started off as funding their own sort of research through expeditions themselves. People would go out on boats and help them with their expeditions. They would go see, whale sharks. They would go see manta rays and they would, take them on dive expeditions and so forth. And that's allowed that organization to really expand in what they can study and how they can study and bring on students and bring on interns and bring on other researchers to be able to work with them full-time, part-time in collaboration, but has made them a fairly large organization and being able to gather information on animals that we've never really known about before, like manta rays and whale sharks, and have made some pretty interesting discoveries at that. So my whole point of this is that there are people out there, scientists out there, who want to drive their funding through a revenue generating service or product. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there is this notion that if you do science, you shouldn't be able to bring in money for it. You should be able to do it from granting organizations and government organizations. And I'm sure there's advantages and disadvantages to both. However, I feel as though this is the new way for others to survive, for others to have a marine biology career to be able to put that. So I don't totally agree with what Eric McNeil is saying here in terms of what this expedition is about. Look, you can do science and you can build a revenue generating service or product business because that's what's needed. You need to fund the work that you're going to do. And if you want to be independent, you want to remain independent, then you need to fund your own stuff. You'll come up with a service or product to generate that revenue. And I think that's really important. So I don't necessarily agree with this. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Let me know in the YouTube, in the comments below, or if you're listening to me on an audio podcast, you can get a hold of me at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram. But just kind of moving on here, other concerns that they're looking for is, the operation is going to be off the coast of Liverpool. It's a surfing area, a popular surfing area. So what the concerns are that it's not going to be far enough off the coast. It's going to attract more sharks to the coast. Now, as a rebuttal, Dr. Neil Hammerschlag said that they are going to be going 5 kilometers. It's quite a distance. It's not going to attract sharks because they're not going to be staying in the same area. It doesn't necessarily mean that these sharks are going to come inland. I don't know about these movements of these great white sharks, where they go on a natural basis. I think that would be really interesting on the scientific studies of where they're going to be spotted, if they do come in close to the coast where there's surfers, or if they stay off the coast. If the boats are going 5 kilometers off, are they going to be tagging these sharks? Are they going to be looking at these? Are they going to be doing a lot of profiles? Because a lot of other expeditions in South Africa and so forth, they know they're sharks. They can tell by, the fins and the markings on the fins and on the backs. So they actually have profiles on these sharks and they know these sharks quite well. They know their individual characters. They know how they behave around boats and what they are like on a day-to-day kind of experience. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where these sharks are going to be. You're going to be spotted and where these sharks are going to go, especially if they get tagged and we get to see where their patterns are. Because that's something I don't know if that's known in the Nova Scotia area, where they go within Nova Scotia. There are other organizations that do tag great white sharks in the area, and they do have some profiles, but probably not enough to really have a formula of what type of sort of patterns they go and distribution patterns these sharks go in. So I think that will be interesting. The other concern is, will the sharks associate boats and humans with feeding? So there are studies out there. There's one study that they actually reference in here, and I'm not completely familiar with it, but it's a 2020 study in the Journal of Environmental Law that backed up some of the statements, because they're saying, the statements, there's a professor, I believe, that's basically saying the most important measure to be taken when dealing with endangered species to protect them from harm. He says, if you're changing their behavior of the animals, you're conditioning them to believe that people mean food. So what the concern is from this researcher is that the food that's being fed to the animals will sort of say, hey, if I see people, they're going to feed me, so I'm going to go closer to people to get fed. Now, that's what apparently it's backed in this 2020 study. That statement is backed in this 2020 study. It says, saying that while tourism may provide economic incentives to protect shark populations, we'll get in that in a bit, in some cases, feeding the animals has both ecological and safety implications. The effects of such actions, the study said, are hotly contested among scientists. So what they're saying is that if there's food involved, there's a behavior change that can happen. And saying that when the sharks look at a boat, they come to the boat because they think they're going to be fed. If they see people, they think they're going to be fed. This is not a scientifically backed study, or sorry, I shouldn't say that. This is not a statement that is scientifically backed. It's actually heavily debated. So I don't know the entirety of if this is a true fact or not, or it's just something that's stated. But it can happen. We've seen in other shark populations where, as they're being fed to be attracted to a specific site for divers or so forth, they can alter their behavior and say, hey, if every time I see a human, I'm going to be fed. And if I'm not, that could be dangerous. We don't want sharks always coming up to people and sort of thinking that every time there's people around, there's going to be food around, because there can be accidents when that happens. And there could be bite events when that happens, which we don't want. But it says here, if we go on, it says in the report, it says most report some behavioral changes in participating sharks, but the significance and severity of the changes is subject to the intense and ongoing debate. That's what the study said. The study was called Blood in the Water, Shark Feeding Tourism and the Law. So Hammerschlag actually disagrees with this, saying the shark is not going to associate a boat with a human. He said the idea is to attract the shark to the boat to get their interest, but their interest might not last very long. He said, and often when the activity stops, the animals go back doing their normal thing and don't seem to hang around those areas. So Neil has had a lot of work with great white sharks, other sharks, hammerhead sharks, tiger sharks, ocean white-tip sharks, and he's done a lot of ecotourism work around those sharks. And I feel as though the controversy that's happening, that's being drummed up with this media, I don't know if it's well intended. I feel as though because there's a scientist involved, I feel better about this. But I would love to hear what you think. I think it's also, I know Neil. I know him very well. I know the work he's done. And so I feel as though I'm more confident in having him at the helm, when they're doing these shark expeditions, knowing that science is going to be a priority, and the communication of of information around the great white sharks is also going to be a priority. So I'm really interested in hearing what he has to say. Hopefully I can get him on the podcast soon. But I would love to hear what you have to say. Hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. You can DM me on Instagram, or you can just leave a comment in the YouTube comments if you're watching this on YouTube. Or you can go to speakupforblue.com/contact. You can just go to that contact page, fill out the form. It goes right to my email. I would love to hear your thoughts on whether or not this great white shark expedition should go should go forward, and your opinions on that. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.